Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and with renewal and rotation right around the corner, there is no better time to take one last look at these sets rotating into Eternal formats to make sure you have all those budget bangers that will continue to work for you in years to come. We'll be looking hard at all four sets, leaving standard, that being the two Innistrad, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, as well as Streets of New Capenna. Likewise, we will be turning a somewhat critical eye on the Alchemy 23 sets, as well as the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set, both of which will be rotating out of Alchemy. But before we get into all that, just a quick reminder that the Stronghold is producing content for you across a number of platforms. And Patreon has recently introduced an option where you can follow our content there without the need for any financial commitment. So even if you aren't ready to support the Stronghold is better positioned to support you. So you never miss out on a thing. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Believe it or not, I've been around Arena for so long that I remember when it was nothing but standard. And in fact, when rotation happened, they had no choice but to delete the cards because they were kind of useless. But of course, since then, the Eternal formats available on Arena have grown by leaps and bounds. In fact, it kind of seems like we have a new one every time we turn around now. I will try and assist you in making small, strategic, and versatile investments in your Eternal collection so that your wild card pool continues to grow while your Eternal options do as well. So how do we go about doing that? And believe it or not, this is already built into the plan. By opening on average 105 packs that you receive for free, or by grinding, you will actually generate about 20 uncommon wild cards and another 20 or so of some combination of rare and mythic. And of course, this doesn't include the incidental wild cards that you actually receive in the pack. This is just accounting for the wild cards that you receive on track for opening packs. I tend to recommend reserving those high rarity wild cards, your rares and mythics, for upgrading decks which have already proven themselves. You enjoy playing them, they have good win rates, and you're just looking to make them better through significant upgrades. On the other hand, those low rarity wild cards, your commons and uncommons, are the perfect resource to use to expand your format and archetype options and find new things to love. As a person who thinks about budget play on Arena quite a lot, I find rather than trying to think about every possible deck that you could build or card that you might want, we can stay more grounded by focusing on what I refer to as the four pillars of budget. That, of course, being the mono-red archetypes, brawl or other singleton archetypes, your build-around, particularly uncommon cards, and those highly versatile singles that you will use over and over again. When it comes to mono red, or really even just red decks, there is one clear standout, and that is Kamanoface's Kakazan for a single red mana at uncommon. I'm sure if you've been around Standard anytime in the last 3 years, you're pretty familiar with this card. It really doesn't ask very much. It goes in nearly any red deck that can produce red mana. And you probably should be running creatures. So overall, not a big ask for a card. Well worth a complete play set if you're going to play any Eternal red decks ever. Play with Fire, on the other hand, is an example of a kind of card that I'm typically not going to talk about. Generally, colors do specific things. Red cards will often produce direct damage. Black cards will often produce destroy effects, Blue will have counter spells and tempo effects. Mono white will have exiles and very often French vanilla creatures that are a little above board. Green will often have very efficient creatures. This has almost always been the case. It almost always will continue to be the case. And those cards will not necessarily distinguish themselves enough to justify the use of a wild card at this type of point in the conversation. For instance, Play with Fire is a single red mana to do 2 direct damage, and despite the fact that it can target anything and gives you a scry ability that is not very commonly seen in red, this card is still just not doing enough to justify a wild card for strictly eternal use. Many other cards will do similar things, often more efficiently, and for heaven's sakes, I don't think they're going to stop printing damage spells in red. Despite these sets having many cool, fun to build around commander options, both as planeswalkers or legendary creatures, I really don't feel like any of them distinguish themselves as truly budget-friendly examples. However, I do think there's 2 cards well worth considering, and to be honest, these could have very easily fit within the strong singles category, but more often than not, I have talked about these in reference to Brawl. The first of which, of course, is the Bank Buster, a card that lets you draw cards and becomes an on-curve creature. You play it on 2, you play a 3-drop that can pilot it, and well, you're just in business and swinging for 4. The other, of course, is the Celestis. This, again, will produce mana for you, life gain, the occasional card draw, just an overall really good rock. Of course, these are both rares, and if I only had to pick one, I would probably have to go with the Reckoner Bank Buster here. These sets may have been a little lacking in those commander-style options, but there is no shortage of build-arounds. Some of the very best uncommon build-arounds, of course, are Jukai Naturalist and Patchwork Automation, enchantment and artifact-based decks, respectively. These cards, as a type, have been printed forever. They will continue to be printed forever. So these cards only become more budget-friendly over time. Oni Cult Anvil was also a darling in Standard at different points. But just as I think its time passed in Standard, I'm not entirely sure this card will see much play in the Eternal formats, even at the budget level. Greasefang is another strong build-around, of course, from Kamigawa, as almost all of these are. It has sprouted a archetype around itself in, well, really every version of Eternal. It's a fantastic deck. I've talked about it on several occasions. But if you're seeing it now for the first time, definitely make a concerted effort to examine the deck lists out there, because these can be expensive. This is not something that you're going to pick up the 4 copies of Greasefang and build the rest of it super good on a budget. This is a major investment deck and should be treated as such. And last but not least, we need to talk about those strong singles. Of course, first up is Secluded Courtyard, giving all of those tribal, typal, kindred style decks in your Eternal future a little bit of smoothing in the mana base. 1 copy here is a fantastic investment now that it's leaving Standard, if you don't already have one. There are some similar cards out there that might be better to add second copies on those rather than additional copies of Secluded Courtyard, but really no downside there. Really, Great Hall of the Citadel is another one of those, believe it or not, common lands. This can tap for 2 different colors of mana to help you cast your legendary creatures. This is almost a must-have in your collection, particularly for those Brawl players. but it can do so much work in so many different legendary matters decks, even outside of Brawl. And of course, High Speed Hover Bike is a colorless card that can literally bring a bit of tempo and evasion to any deck really that runs creatures. And well, let's be honest, how many decks don't run creatures? And don't think lower rarities get all the fun. We've got a couple of mythics here to talk about. First, the elephant in the room, the One Ring, legendary artifact, mythic rare. I'm not going to tell you this isn't a good card, because it absolutely is. It will see play in your collection if you choose to pick up this card. That having been said, it is really at its best and most at home in a controlled deck. And control decks, whether that's a blue-white control or any other version out there, tend to be less budget-friendly. Secondly, a one-of copy of the One Ring is really not going to pull its weight. You ideally want 3, if not 4 copies in most of those competitive level decks. And that can be a very major mythic commitment for a lot of us. Consider then using a single mythic wildcard for a copy of Andril Flame of the West, also a legendary artifact, also a mythic, but really all this card needs is a creature, a theme that we have talked about a lot within this video. Most decks are going to have creatures. This one is a win con in and of itself because it creates more evasive creatures, which can then pick up the Flame of the West and not only do more damage, but continue to create more creatures as needed. A +3/+1 is a big boost, and creating creatures with flying is pretty awesome in its own right. Of course, this card does remarkably well in a Brawl deck where you're guaranteed to have legendary creatures, but those creatures don't have to be legendary for this to just begin to pop off as a win condition in its own right. So there it is, guys. Those are my crafting thoughts with regards to these sets about to rotate out of Standard and Alchemy. You will, of course, notice that nothing was really mentioned from A23. There are a few options for commanders and things like that, like I said, in the commander segment, but nothing that I think really distinguishes itself as a budget banger. Hey, what do you guys think? Did I leave something out? What do you think are your plans for crafting at this stage in the game? Or do you already have everything you feel like you need? Again, this wasn't intended to be a comprehensive list of every good card in these sets, but the ones that if you didn't have them today might be worth your consideration. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank my totally awesome patrons for supporting me and allowing me to apply my passion into a community. And of course, before we go, I've got some suggestions for your next step.